So this is the community membership, and welcome. It's ongoing. As I said, it's monthly, drop in when you can, £10 per session just to cover my time. And I've planned them on Wednesdays, although obviously if we get more people, I may decide to do 2, and then I may vary the day, because obviously some people can't do Wednesdays at 4, but that seemed to be a time generally that people can slot in. Different topics each time, all around the theme of emotions, healing, trauma, that sort of thing. And you already know how to join because you have. Okay. The emotional masterclass I'm working on, the next one, the full works will be starting in September. That's the one where you do it as a group. But I'm also working on an evergreen version where you can access the material whenever you like. And that's ongoing. I'm working on that at the moment. And the next community program is not the 15th, because that was last month. I'll tell you that at the end. I did update the slide at the end. So welcome. All right. I'm going to do the short presentation now. And we've taken your video off, and you know that. So I've really already raised all that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about shame, the imprint of shame, and its extreme, which is narcissism. And a little recap of what we covered in recent sessions. By the way, the recent sessions are all on my YouTube channel. So if you go to my YouTube channel, which is accessible from my website, there's a little YouTube icon in the top right. You'll find previous months' recordings are all there. They're all free. But here's roughly what we've done in the last 3 sessions. We've talked about shame because shame is a bodily experience, not a thought-based one. And that's a really important piece of information. You actually feel shame in your body, and it has physiological effects. And it's an experience of disconnection with our internal safety signals as well. So it isn't just that you feel ashamed of something. That's a far too simplistic understanding of what shame is. It's an experience of, I don't know who I am. I don't know whether I'm worthy of being here. And I'm not sure if it's safe to be here. And so it's a total disconnect. And because our brains and bodies are adapted physiologically to connect with others, in other words, we are regulated by our connection with others in order to be safe and therefore to function well, you can imagine if there is a disconnect, that is going to have huge ramifications for our well-being. And there are lots of things that get in the way of this connection. So for instance, an attachment wound. Now, Justine and I were talking about that this morning. It's been in the news that dementia can often result from attachment wounds as well. It's one of the other impacts. An attachment wound is where our bonding to mother usually, and also father later on, fails in some way, or it becomes insecure. When that happens, it doesn't just affect our relationship with our parent, it actually means that our brain development is affected and the brain fails to integrate properly. In other words, the neural connections fail to regulate themselves, and you get a disintegration of your brain. And that's where you kind of get these shame messages, these belief structures that we're not enough, or that we don't deserve well-being, or we don't deserve goodness in our life. And when this happens, particularly between the ages of 3 to 5, that is where narcissism in particular results. And I'm going to describe what narcissism is. And you may already know, because you may have had a narcissistic parent or a narcissistic partner. But just to reiterate, the brain itself has different structures and different levels to it based on this sort of triangle of needs. And at the base of your brain, that's really where you're dealing with your physiological needs of air, water, food, shelter, sleep, those vital things. And that corresponds to your brain stem, which is your most ancient part of your brain. And sort of moving up into safety needs like security and employment and resources and health, moving up through to your limbic system, where we're more dealing with love and belonging, friendship, connection, intimacy, family. Those sorts of things are all very important. And then the higher levels of the brain are more to do with esteem, you know, self-worth, respect, status, also identity, and a sense of freedom, you know, that we have the freedom to be who we are, until we get right to the highest level of organization of our brain, which is the cortex, which is our logical self. And if we're lucky in life, we reach the point of self-actualization. And that is the desire to become the most that one can be, you know, to really express yourself as an authentic self. And I have to be honest with you, few people truly get to that state. And one of the main, you know, focus of my work is to get you to a state of self-actualization. So being your authentic self, the best self you can be. And it's usually because the lower levels of your brain have not been integrated. And so you're lacking a sense of safety or a sense of physiological regulation or a sense of belonging in life. You cannot actualize if you are missing the base of your pyramid there. So it's very interesting, isn't it, that we need everything in place to feel fully harmonic with ourselves, you know, in the right place. And just to remind you, shame, you're not born with shame. Although, in fact, you can have a difficult birth experience and it can teach you shame, but it's a learned experience of non-connection. In other words, a sense of abandonment. And it's not a thought, it's a feeling that your body feels disconnected and abandoned and unsafe. And it teaches you very quickly that you are not enough. And how you are not enough, whether you are not, I don't know, clever enough or pretty enough or active enough or man enough or woman enough or whatever, is dependent on your family structure. But the basic feeling of not enough is very, very common, and it leads to all sorts of shame behaviors. I dealt with those in the last session where we talked about shaming other people. And shame is a natural part of human development. Okay, so it's not, you're not born with it, but it is something that comes in as a natural part of human development. But in some families, it's used as a strategy to limit behavior and thus authentic expression. So families may use shame in order to stop you doing stuff that they don't approve of or they don't want. And that may be largely down to their experience of growing up and what they find acceptable. And it can be overused, of course. So that's what we find. And it tends to run in families as well, because if your parents were shamed as children, they tend to parent in that way too. So remember, our brain needs safety before our physiology can harmonize. It's one of the 5 human needs that are shown here in this pyramid. And thus shame impacts people because it stops you feeling safe or that you belong in this world. And just a bit more on attachment wounding before we get on to narcissism fully. Insecure attachment is where it's not a reliable connection to the caregivers that raised you. And it can happen for a number of common reasons. And I'm just going to list a few here, and you may have experiences in your history of some of these, or you may not. Yours may be slightly different, but these are just common ones I come across. The depression or emotional unavailability of a parent, particularly mum. As I've mentioned already, a difficult birth experience or a birth trauma, you know, you come into the world with suction or forceps or emergency cesarean. a childhood illness or hospitalization, you're taken away from your family to be taken into hospital, and that's a sense of abandonment for a child. School humiliation or bullying, which creates a sense of isolation. You feel like no one's there for you, which is the essence of trauma. And bereavement, that's what I had, the loss of a parent or sibling, which again is sort of like an abandonment or just a great loss. And these kinds of common attachment wounds are very, very common, actually. 30 to 40% of people have one or more. And we found this out through a study called the ACE study, which was the Adverse Childhood Experience study from the late 1990s, where they interviewed over 17,500 people as part of a sort of health study for one of the health maintenance organizations in the US. And the results were amazing. They had no idea that trauma would be so common. And they were looking at really overt trauma like abuse and abandonment and having a parent in prison and alcoholic parents and these sorts of things. I'm looking more at these more common attachment wounds. So if what they found was true, which was that, at least 70% of people had at least one, I'm saying that 30-40% of people have these attachment wounds, these common attachment wounds. It could be even higher. I could be completely underestimating it. And just to, I know that I don't want to overwhelm you with information, and this is all in my book, The Scar That Won't Heal, but the attachment styles are just important, and I've color coded them here. So what an attachment style is a pattern of attachment. So the green one there is the secure attachment, which as I've said is the least common in a way, 30% of people, where your needs for emotional connection are met consistently, and you're able to learn to self-soothe because your mother is able to self-soothe and she learns to soothe you. And therefore you become mutually regulated in your nervous systems. You understand each other instinctively and you're able to regulate each other automatically, all right? And that's honestly how it should be. Of course, for the vast majority of people, it isn't. And then we have these two amber styles, and these are slightly more difficult, and they're what we call insecure attachment. And there are two different types here. And you may, as I'm talking, you may recognize yourself or someone you know as this particular style. So there's what we call the ambivalent or anxious attachment, where the child is both drawn to and repelled by the caregiver. That's the ambivalent bit. You both want and you don't want. And because you're not getting your needs reliably met, you don't know what to do, but you tend to fall into this pattern of connection where you kind of have a preference for regulation by other people. You look to them to help you, to kind of solve the problem. You reach out, you want connection, but sometimes mother is not the one to solve that for you, and you may seek contact but then pull away, and you can see that in very young children. The child is perceiving a confusion, and they're both confused and confusing to the parent because the parent doesn't know whether to step in or not, and so it becomes this push-pull, and they become quite anxious adults. And I just want to say and put my hand up here, and I don't know if any of you would recognize that's my style, okay? And we're focused on past failure as well. All the things you did wrong seem to pull you somehow, and what that results in is a very high cortisol level, and cortisol is your main stress hormone. So you end up highly anxious and focused on being liked and needed by other people and getting help from others. But there is the opposite to that, which is also an insecure style, but it's what we call the avoidant. And you tend to attract partners of the opposite style, by the way. So you may have, if you're like me, you may be attracted to avoidant types, which is where the parent has actually been rejected by that child, and they grow up as adults who tend to reject connection. And instead, they show a preference for distraction, self-regulation, in other words. So numbing, you know, box sets, drinking, online stuff, you know. They don't really seek connection when they're feeling dysregulated. They tend to just zone out, and they become dismissive adults. In other words, they don't really take on board emotions. They don't know how to emote. They find it really hard when other people get emotional, and they are low cortisol people. It doesn't mean they're healthier. It just means their cortisol is kind of not really regulating them. They're still not functioning as well as they need to be. And then at the bottom, and I've color coded that in red because this is a really difficult situation, and that's a disorganized attachment style where nothing worked as a child. It didn't matter whether they connected or disconnected. The parent was not available to them, and they become highly dysregulated adults. They show dissociative tendencies. And what do I mean by that? They tend to have things like fainting, going into a trance, rocking, bedwetting. Addictions are very common, as are compulsive behaviors. And the vast majority of people who are in psychiatric care are disorganized attachment styles. So I don't tend to see these people. They tend to already be on high medication, and you know, they're maybe being seen in the conventional medical arena. But I do sometimes, I certainly find dissociation commonly, because you can move slightly up and down this ladder, if you like. You can be disorganized with, say, your parents, but another style with you know, someone you trust. So it's not fixed in stone, but you tend to have a preference for one of these styles. Now, these two in the middle are the ones which tend to create narcissists. Okay. And weirdly, narcissists tend to attract people called codependents. These are all psychological terms. So narcissists are these types of people who are lacking in empathy. They tend to have a sense of self-importance and a sense of entitlement. They know what's right and they're going to tell you. And they tend to attract people who are highly sensitive, people-pleasing, you know, have low self-esteem. And they kind of meet in the middle, but we tend to find there's an overlap because it's all low self-esteem and it's all shame imprints. Whether you're a codependent or a narcissist, you have low self-esteem. You just show it in different ways. You both feel a basic insecurity stemming from these early parental relationships, these attachment wounds. And you doubt the reliability of others to satisfy emotional needs. You base your self-esteem on the behavior and responses of others, and you idealize others to augment your own lack of self-esteem. So it's not surprising that you attract each other because you have many things in common. Now, in relationship, when narcissists come into a relationship with someone, they can be really charming initially. We call that love bombing. And they hide their neediness by being self-assured and in control. And they're very adept at making people admire and like them. And it's very attractive. Now, again, I'm going to be really honest here. I don't think I'm a narcissist, but I do recognize I have narcissistic tendencies. And, you know, I can, you know, be whatever people want me to be in some instances, or at least I used to be able to. And I don't know if any of you have recognized that in yourself, but I certainly was good at making people like me until I realized that that wasn't giving me what I needed. Lacking empathy, they have an inflated self-importance. Now, I don't think I lack empathy. If anything, I have too much. And I actually don't have an inflated sense of self-importance. It's quite the opposite way for me. So, but I do tend to attract narcissists. So I think I'm probably what you would think of as more a codependent style. So they do have huge areas of overlap. That's what I really wanted to say. So if you're a highly sensitive person, HSP, or a people pleaser, you tend to attract narcissists, unfortunately. And what tends to happen in relationships is all goes really well for a while you are performing and they are performing, until reality strikes and it creeps in, and the narcissist will discover that their partner is inadequate to their impossibly high expectations, or then they get threatened that their flawed self, their empty self, because they don't have a great grounding, will be revealed as the expectations for emotional intimacy increase. Because as you go on in a relationship, you're going to get closer and closer, hopefully. And this really challenges the narcissist. And any slight or imagined chink in the ideal image of their partner, because they tend to idealize their partner, feels really painful to the narcissist. And that's why they start to correct you and start to step in and try and want to change you. So as this vision of the perfection of their partner deteriorates, their hidden shame increasingly causes discomfort, which they then project onto the partner, whom they criticize and devalue. And so you'll start to get the downhill slide. The codependent partner then feels drained, hurt, resentful, and lonely in the relationship. And that's kind of, they start to doubt their own sanity as well. And so creates this downward spiral of a kind of disrespect and lack of caring in the relationship, which makes them more and more likely to disappoint the partner, of course, because they start to lose their own sense of self and self-esteem. And then a narcissist kind of will ratchet up the control. They will tend to mask their true identity with a false self. You know, they appear to other people to be really competent, really lovely people, really, you know, generous and kind. But it creates a cognitive dissonance. In other words, a sort of, it doesn't feel true within the relationship. And yet you're seeing the narcissist perform in this amazing way with other people, but in your own brain and in your own home, this isn't how you're feeling them. And so they start to doubt their sanity, the partner. Another thing they can often do, narcissists, is insert another person into the relationship. So they'll start to say things like, I wish you'd be more like this person or that person. No, parents often do that, narcissistic parents, to provoke feelings of insecurity and uncertainty. Because when you're being compared to other people and you're falling short, of course, you're going to start to feel like you're on rocky ground now. And as I've intimated, they often shapeshift. So they're different with different people to get admiration and ego stroking. And they'll often do what's called gaslighting as well. So they will tell you that you are the problem, not them, when you start to say, but what about, you know, if only, could you not be more like this? And they'll say, you're the one with the problem, not me. And that in turn evokes this sense of self-doubt. So then we enter this cycle, the idealization, which is where it begins, the devaluation, and then the discard. So first of all, they make you the centerpiece of their life. Then they start to turn hot and cold, and there's occasional abuse, until finally you get to this demeaning state of humiliation and abandonment. And it's a really tragic thing when it happens in an adult relationship, but it's also very, very difficult when it's your parent, because they're the people that you most need to turn to when things get tough. And if one of your parents is like this, there is no safe haven. And so I'm going to stop there, because I've covered a lot and I don't want to overwhelm people. I just wanted to give you some information about narcissism. And next time I'll be looking a bit more about how to deal with narcissists, because there are a variety of different tools and techniques to kind of heal yourself and get out of those kinds of relationships. So just to say, the next session will be Wednesday, August the 10th. I just wanted to get that in the recording. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing